The Emancipation Proclamation, or Proclamation 95, was a presidential proclamation and executive order issued by United States President Abraham Lincoln on September 22, 1862, during the Civil War.
Proclamation International Impact.
As Lincoln had hoped, the proclamation turned foreign popular opinion in favor of the Union by gaining the support of anti-slavery and countries that had already abolished slavery. This shift ended the Confederacy's hopes of gaining official recognition. Public opinion in Britain would not tolerate support for slavery.
Gettysburg Address.
On July 1, 1863, after invading the North, Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee meet Union forces at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The battle rages over 3 days, involving heavy artillery duels and high casualties on both sides. The battle is considered a major turning point in the Eastern Theater. Lee withdraws and is forced to fight a defensive campaign for the rest of the war until the end on April 9, 1865. On November 19th, Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg Address at a ceremony to dedicate a cemetery for the Union war dead. He invoked the Declaration of Independence and its principles of liberty and equality, and spoke of a new birth of freedom for the nation. American people transformed it from a war for union to a war for union and freedom. Being the proclamation contingent on the victory of the states of the Union and us, be applied in the whole country, Gettysburg paved the way to victory and consequently the liberation of thousands of slaves who looked to the future with the hope of freedom not just as a war measure.
Postbellum.
Near the end of the war, abolitionists were concerned that the Emancipation Proclamation would be construed solely as a war measure, Lincoln's original intent, and would no longer apply once fighting ended. They also were increasingly anxious to secure the freedom of all slaves, not just those freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Thus pressed, Lincoln staked a large part of his 1864 presidential campaign on a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery uniformly throughout the United States. Winning re-election, Lincoln pressed the lame duck 38th Congress to pass the proposed amendment immediately rather than wait for the incoming 39th Congress. In January 1865, Congress sent to the state legislatures for ratification what became the 13th Amendment, banning slavery in all U.S. states and territories. The amendment was ratified by the legislatures of enough states by December 6, 1865, and proclaimed 12 days later.
Critiques.
As the years went on and American life continued to be deeply unfair towards blacks, cynicism towards Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation increased. Perhaps the strongest attack was Lerone Bennett's Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream, which claimed that Lincoln was a white supremacist, who issued the Emancipation Proclamation in lieu of the real racial reforms for which radical abolitionists pushed. Other historians have given more credit to Lincoln for what he accomplished within the tensions of his cabinet and a society at war, for his own growth in political and moral stature, and for the promise he held out to the slaves.
Legacy in the Civil Rights Era. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made many references to the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil Rights Movement. These include a speech made at an observance of the 100th anniversary of the issuing of the proclamation made in New York City on September 12, 1962, where he placed it alongside the Declaration of Independence as an imperishable contribution to civilization. In the early 1960s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his associates developed a strategy to call on President John F. Kennedy to bypass a Southern segregationist opposition in the Congress by issuing an executive order to put an end to segregation. This envisioned document was referred to as the Second Emancipation Proclamation.
President John F. Kennedy.
On June 11, 1963, President Kennedy appeared on national television to address the issue of civil rights. He told Americans that 2 black students had been peacefully enrolled in the University of Alabama despite the opposition of Governor George Wallace. John Kennedy called it a moral issue. Invoking the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, "100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free." During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson invoked the Emancipation Proclamation, holding it up as a promise yet to be fully implemented. As vice president while speaking from Gettysburg on May 30, 1963, Memorial Day, at the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, Johnson connected it directly with the ongoing civil rights struggles of the time, saying 100 years ago, the slave was freed. 100 years later, the Negro remains in bondage to the color of his skin. In this hour, it is not our respective races which are at stake, it is our nation.
Prologue.
Although the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the nation, it placed the issue squarely on top of the wartime agenda. It added moral force to the Union cause and was a significant milestone leading to the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, formally outlawing slavery throughout the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation linked the preservation of American constitutional government to the end of slavery.